Intersection worked example. At the bookshop, you can either buy a book about history, excluding a cooking book, with a probability of 0.4, or a book about cooking, excluding a history book, with a probability of 0.3, or you can buy both these books with a probability of 0.3. What is the probability that you'll buy a cooking and a history book? So firstly, let's start off with representing this with a Venn diagram. So we draw a rectangle representing our entire sample space, and we denote this often with omega. And then we'll use one circle for the event of buying a history book, another one for buying a cooking book, and we'll let H be the event that we buy a history book. So let H be the event of purchasing a history book, and we let C be the event of purchasing a cooking book. Now there's something important that needs to be noted in this question. In the question, it was exactly specified that you buy a book about history excluding a cooking book. So if we buy, the probability that we buy a history book and a cooking book is the probability of H intersect C, where this symbol over here represents intersect, the intersection. So it also represents and, it means and. I'm buying a history and a cooking book. But they're telling us that we're buying a history book excluding a cooking book. So that means that we have the probability that we purchase a history book and we don't purchase a cooking book, where this little c over here, this superscript c, means the complement. So it means that we're not buying a cooking book. The complement of a cooking book means we're not buying a cooking book. So it's where we buy a history book and we don't buy the cooking book. And that's what is told to us over here in this question. So you need to read carefully. We can either buy a book about history excluding a cooking book, which means the probability of H intersect C complement, and that is equal to 0.4. And if we denote H being the left-hand circle in the Venn diagram and C being the right-hand one, then this H intersect C complement is this entire region over here. It's the entire area inside H, but excluding wherever C touches. So it's this whole area that is shaded over here. So this area is said to be 0.4. Then we are told that we can buy a book about cooking excluding a history book. So it's the same story for this side. So now we're buying a cooking book. Now we're buying a cooking book, but we're not buying the history book. And this is occurring with a probability of 0.3. This is the probability of buying a cooking book and not buying the history book. So probability of C intersect with H complement. And that is equal to 0.3. So the left-hand one is the probability of having a history book and not buying the cooking book. And then the last piece of information that we're given in the diagram is that the probability of buying a history and a cooking book, which is this shaded region here in the middle, this is the probability of H intersect C. This is equal to the probability that we buy both these books, so both these books, and that is 0.3. So now we have the probability of H intersect C complement, the probability of H intersect C, the probability of C intersect H complement, and now we have represented this entire event of buying the history book or a cooking book or buying both the books in a Venn diagram. And we can verify that everything is fine by adding up the probabilities. So we have 0.4 plus 0.3 for the H intersect C plus 0.3 over here for the probability that we just bought the cooking book, and that is equal to the probability that we bought at least one book, and that is equal to 1. So as we can see, the total of the probabilities are 1. Everything is fine with our Venn diagram, and that's how we look at an intersection and a worked example. Now, as a further comment, I'd like to point out something very important. The probability of buying a history book is equal to the event that you bought a history book and a cooking book, as well as the probability that it's included with the probability that you bought a history book and you didn't buy the cooking book. Because you either buy the cooking book with the history book, or you just buy the history book on its own. So when you're doing probability-based questions, be careful to read about how the question is phrased. In this question, it's explicitly phrased that we bought the history book, excluding the cooking book. That means that we looked at this probability for the 0.4. But if you were asked, what is the probability that he bought a history book? Well, then you would have to say it's this entire circle over here. So you'd have to say it is the probability that he bought a history book and a cooking book, which is 0.3. And you'd have to include the probability that he bought a history book, but not the cooking book, which was 0.4. So the probability that he buys a history book is equal to 0.7. So that's the final comment that I'd like to make on this intersection example.